It was a morning like any other. I woke up before dawn, as I always did, and went straight to my kneeler. The weight on my chest was already there, that tightness that had been with me for months, but I ignored it. I prayed for the faithful, for the Pope, for the Church. But something wouldn't leave my mind. A feeling that something was wrong, as if the ground beneath my feet was about to give way. During the Mass, everything seemed normal until, at the moment of consecration, a sharp pain cut through my chest like a knife. I tried to hold on to the altar, but my legs simply disappeared. I fell to my knees, and the last thing I saw was the crucifix above me, the eyes of Christ seeming to stare at me with deep sadness. Then, only darkness. But that wasn't the end. Suddenly, I was floating above my own body, seeing the faithful screaming, someone calling an ambulance. I tried to speak, but no one heard me. And then, a force pulled me upwards, and the ceiling of the church simply disappeared. What came next was something that no words can adequately describe. I was no longer anywhere, but at the same time, everywhere. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't a hallucination. It was more real than anything I had ever experienced. A light enveloped me, but it wasn't like sunlight or a lamp. It was warm, alive, as if it were breathing. And even though I couldn't see anyone, I knew that God was there. Not in form, not in voice, but in a presence so strong that it brought me to my knees. In the middle of nowhere, that's when he appeared. Not like in the church paintings, not like I imagined. Jesus was there, and his eyes, man, his eyes seemed to know everything about me. From the day I was born to the most hidden thoughts that I wouldn't even admit to myself. I wanted to cry, to hide, but at the same time I had never felt so safe. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me with an expression that mixed love and an urgency that cut to my soul. I knew something very important was about to happen. I wasn't prepared for what I saw next. Jesus reached out his hand, and suddenly it was as if I could see the entire church at once. Every parish, every diocese, all at once. Some of them shone with a golden light, so bright it hurt to look at them. I could feel their faith, as if each prayer was a living flame. But others were almost extinguished. I could see the faithful inside, praying, but it was mechanical, empty. The worst part was that many of them didn't even notice. Then came the part that made me tremble. I saw leaders of the church, priests, bishops, cardinals, and some were enveloped in a beautiful light, but others, it was as if a dark mist had covered them. And in the middle of it all, Pope Francis. He was alone, praying, but you could see a huge weight on his shoulders, a shadow trying to get close, as if it wanted to influence him. Jesus didn't need to say anything. I knew right away that this was a much bigger battle than any of us could imagine. The vision changed again, and this time it was as if I was seeing behind the scenes of the church. There were angels, yes, but also dark things I couldn't quite describe. Not monsters, but shapes that distorted the air, whispering things that made people's faith wither. The worst part was that they didn't attack violently. It was more subtle. A bishop here, a priest there, beginning to think that maybe the doctrine needs to change to please more people, or that certain teachings were too harsh for today's times. I could see the confusion spreading like a slow poison. Jesus finally spoke, and his voice was not a sound, but a truth that echoed straight into my spirit. They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. It was as if each word weighed a ton. I wanted to cry, because right then and there I understood that the danger did not come from outside the church. It came from within. People who still prayed, who still wore their vestments, but who had forgotten the essentials. Then he showed me something that took my breath away. Ordinary, faithful people who went to Mass every Sunday, but who lived as if God did not exist from Monday to Saturday. Suddenly I was in a place I recognized. It was the Vatican, but different. The air was heavy, like before a storm. I saw Pope Francis again, only now he was surrounded by other church leaders. Some had straight faces, full of determination, but others were arguing in low voices, and I could feel the division. One group wanted to update the church. Another was shouting that it was a betrayal of everything we believed in. The Pope looked exhausted, as if he were carrying the weight of the world. And in the midst of it all, those shadows, lurking, waiting. Jesus pulled me close and said, "The battle is not against flesh and blood." I understood immediately. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about ideologies. It was a spiritual war that most people didn't even see. Some priests were still fighting. I saw one of them, an old man with calloused hands from praying the rosary, and the light around him was so bright that the shadows didn't come close. But there were only a few of them. Many were too busy arguing, afraid of appearing radical or out of this world. And meanwhile outside, people were leaving the churches, confused, not knowing who to believe. My vision deepened, and I began to see things that made me tremble to my very soul. Churches that I knew, where I used to celebrate Mass, now seemed like empty houses. The walls were there, the benches, the altars, but the essentials were gone. I could see priests celebrating Mass without believing what they were saying. The faithful receiving the host as if it were just another ritual, without that sacred fear. The worst thing was the silence. Where before there had been the voice of the Spirit, now only a cold emptiness echoed. Jesus showed me something even more frightening. Young priests being trained in seminaries where no one spoke about hell, sin, or the need for conversion. Teachers laughed when someone mentioned the devil as if it was something for ignorant people. And I saw clearly how these shadows took advantage of this. They whispered in the ears of the seminarians, "Don't be radical, that's a thing of the past. Be more understanding." And many, without realizing it, were gradually giving up the truth until there was almost nothing left. Suddenly the scene changed. Again, I was in Rome, but in a secret meeting, important cardinals discussing the future of the church. Some, with stern faces, insisted, "We cannot change what we have always believed." Others, with compassionate expressions, replied, "The world has changed. We must adapt." And in the middle of it all, Pope Francis, his face etched with anguish, as if he felt the weight of every word. Shadows danced around the table, and I realized with horror that some of the cardinals were not even aware of their influence. Jesus made me look more closely at one cardinal in particular. Outwardly, he seemed like a holy man, impeccable robes, careful words. But as my spiritual vision deepened, I saw that his heart was filled with ambition. He did not serve Christ, he served himself. And worse, he was convinced that he was right. The shadows whispered in his ear that he could do good more easily if he rose to the top, if he gained influence. It was the most dangerous temptation to think that the ends justify the means, even in the house of God. The scene expanded, and I saw millions of ordinary Catholics around the world. Many were confused, not knowing who to believe. Some prayed the rosary fervently, keeping their faith alive. Others had exchanged the truth for a lighter version of Christianity, a faith without sacrifice, without the cross, without conversion. I saw families that were once exemplary, now divided because their children no longer believed in anything. And the saddest thing, many priests and bishops, instead of warning, approved all of this, afraid of losing their followers. Jesus then showed me something unexpected. Small groups of lay people and priests who were resisting. They were not in the great cathedrals, but in basements, in hidden rooms, celebrating the true faith with tears in their eyes. The light around them was intense, and the shadows could not come near. "These are my remnant," I heard Jesus say, and I understood. Even when all seems lost, God always keeps for himself those who do not bow the knee to Baal. But the message was clear. The time of choice was coming for everyone. The vision grew even more intense. I saw the future, two possible paths for the church. The first was a stunning renewal. Churches filled with truly converted people, priests filled with the Holy Spirit, sacraments lived deeply. But there was another darker path. Empty churches turned into museums, doctrines distorted to please the world. A faith so diluted that it no longer saved anyone. And most shockingly, both futures were possible depending on the choices we made now. Jesus looked me in the eye and said something I will never forget. The decisive battle will be for the Eucharist. I saw then a terrible attack on the holy sacrifice of the Mass, attempts to change the words of consecration, to make communion something common, to empty its meaning. And worse, many of the faithful would not even notice the difference because they no longer believed in the real presence. Tears rolled down my face when I understood it was all about this. Without the true Eucharist, the Church would be just another human institution. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain. I was being pulled back. The light began to fade and I screamed, "No, not yet, I need to understand more." But it was no use. The last thing I saw was Jesus saying, "You must warn them. Pray and do penance." Then, bam! I was back in my body with unbearable pain in my chest, doctors screaming, the deafening noise of the defibrillator. I had screamed in Latin without realizing it, and the nurses were shocked. One of them said he came back speaking the language of the Church. In the days that followed, as I lay recovering in the hospital, everything seemed different. The colors, the smells, even the air I breathed, everything had an eerie quality, as if I no longer fully belonged in this world. The doctors couldn't explain how I had survived. My heart had stopped for more than 15 minutes. But I knew why. I had a mission. The problem was, how could I tell this story without sounding like a madman? How could I convince people that we were on the brink of a spiritual abyss? When I finally returned to my parish, everything seemed the same, and yet completely different. The candles on the altar, the wooden pews, the smell of incense. It was as if I could now see through appearances. During the first Mass, I celebrated after the experience. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would fail. When I raised the host at the moment of consecration, my hands shook so much I almost dropped it, because now I knew, in a way that no theological study could teach, that this really was Christ. But what frightened me most was realizing what was happening in my own church. People I had known for years, good Catholics, were now receiving communion as if it were a sacred biscuit without any fear. Some no longer even made the sign of the cross before receiving it. And worst of all, I could see shadows around them, rubbing their hands in glee. I tried to preach about it in my sermon, but the words came out garbled. I saw looks of confusion, a few yawns, a lady complaining that the Mass was getting too long. No one seemed to understand the urgency. I decided to talk to the bishop. I set up an appointment and told him everything I had seen, trying to remain calm. He listened to me with an expression I couldn't quite read, a mix of concern, disbelief, and maybe a little fear. When I finished, he sighed deeply and said, "Father, you've been through a lot of trauma. Maybe you should consider taking some time off." He suggested I see a psychologist. My stomach dropped as I realized he didn't believe me. Or worse, maybe he did, but he was afraid to face the truth. Over the next few months, I tried to warn other priests around me. Some looked at me with compassion, as if I had lost my mind. Others, to my surprise, quietly confessed that they too sensed something was very wrong, but didn't know what to do. One, an old friend, took me aside after Mass and said with tears in his eyes, "I know you're telling the truth, but if I say this in public, I'll be removed from ministry." That's when I realized the depth of the darkness that had set in. Good priests afraid to speak the truth for fear of reprisal. I began to notice small things that would have gone unnoticed before. A catechist teaching that the important thing is to be a good person, without mentioning Jesus. Or salvation. A group of young people from the parish organizing a retreat where they talked more about self-help than conversion. The Eucharist being treated as a mere symbol in some homilies. Every detail cut me like a knife, because now I saw what was behind it. A slow, almost imperceptible erosion of authentic faith. The final straw came when a young priest, fresh out of theology school, said to me with a laugh, "Father, your talk of the devil and sin is so outdated. Today we need to talk about inclusion and love without judgment." He said this as he adjusted his colorful stole, which did not follow liturgical norms, before Mass. I tried to argue that true love includes warning about danger, but he just shook his head, as if I were a dinosaur who didn't understand modern times. That night I cried in my room like I hadn't cried since I was a child. That's when I started to act differently. I began to pray the rosary every day before dawn, kneeling on the cold floor of the sacristy. I introduced weekly adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, teaching the faithful about the real presence. In my homilies, I stopped talking about generic topics and started preaching about sin, confession, hell, and heaven, the hard truths that no one wanted to hear anymore. At first, some people complained. One couple even changed parishes. But others, few but faithful, began to thank me in secret. Finally, someone is telling the truth, they said. The strangest thing was that the more I held firm, the more obstacles appeared. The church's sound system began to mysteriously fail during my homilies. I received anonymous letters calling me a fanatic. Even my superior called me in for a talk about maintaining harmony in the parish. But beautiful things also began to happen. True conversions, sincere confessions, people returning to the faith after years of straying. It was as if, as the contrast between light and darkness became clearer, people were forced to choose sides. One day, something extraordinary happened. During the consecration at the 6 a.m. Mass, which was usually attended by only about 5 elderly people, a lady I had never seen before began to cry profusely. After Mass, she came to me and said, "Father, during the elevation of the host I saw Jesus. He was there like a king, with a crown of thorns and a red cloak, and behind him I saw you and other priests surrounded by angels, fighting against horrible things that were trying to get close to the altar." I got goosebumps. This was exactly what I had seen in my experience. This lady had no idea what I had been through. Strange news began to arrive from other dioceses. A priest in another state reported having had a dream very similar to the one I had experienced. A group of contemplative nuns claimed to have had visions of a great battle for the church. It seemed as if the Holy Spirit was spreading the same warning to several places at once. But in clerical meetings, these reports were treated as emotional phenomena or post-traumatic stress disorder. The more confirmations came, the more the hierarchy seemed to want to ignore them. 2 years have passed since my experience. Today, my parish is different. I have lost many faithful who preferred churches with a lighter message, but those who remain are ardent believers. We started a prayer group that meets every night to pray for the Pope and the Church. Some young men, contrary to all statistics, have started attending daily Mass and are even showing interest in the priesthood. One of them said to me, "I want to be a priest like you who still truly believes." I cried when I heard that, but the struggle continues. I recently received a summons to appear before the bishop. Some of my homilies were recorded and sent to the Curia as examples of fundamentalism. I know that I could be removed at any moment. Sometimes in the early hours of the morning when I'm alone in church before the tabernacle, I ask Jesus, was it worth it? Did I do enough? I never hear an audible answer, but I feel a peace that comes from the depths of my soul. I know that what is to come will be worse, but I also know that the final victory is already assured. I just don't know if I will be here to see it. What hurts me most is not the opposition, but the indifference. Good people who love God, but who fail to see the danger. Like a mother who told me, "Father, you are exaggerating. The church has already been through worse crises. She does not understand that this is exactly what the shadows want us to think, that there is no urgency, that everything will resolve itself. Meanwhile, I see young people in catechism who no longer know how to make the sign of the cross properly, adults who see no problem in skipping Mass for any reason, parents who no longer teach their children to pray. Sometimes I find myself looking at old photos from my ordination. All those young priests, full of ideals. Where are they now? Some have left the priesthood. Others have become bureaucrats of the faith, more concerned with their ecclesiastical careers than with saving souls. A few, like me, try to swim against the current, but the fatigue is great. Only the Eucharist sustains me. When I hold the consecrated host, I feel the same presence that I found in that light. And that is enough. Last week I had a dream. I was once again before Jesus, and he was showing me the future. I saw storms coming for the church, persecutions, divisions, betrayals. But I also saw something beautiful. Small groups of believers scattered throughout the world, keeping their faith pure, as if in modern catacombs. I saw young priests with the courage of martyrs. I saw lay people who knew more theology than many priests because they had to defend their faith every day. And at the center of it all, the Eucharist, hidden, venerated, persecuted, but never extinguished. I woke up with my heart pounding. It was the confirmation I needed. Since then, I have stopped worrying so much about opposition. I have started keeping a journal of everything I saw during my near-death experience, so that it will be recorded when I am no longer here. I teach altar boys to celebrate Mass with reverence, in the hope that at least one of them will carry on this flame. And I pray. I pray as if each Hail Mary were a brick in a wall of protection against the approaching darkness. Today is my 50th anniversary as a priest. In the diocese organized a small celebration. A few priests came, but not many. The bishop sent a generic letter of congratulations. But what touched me most was a group of lay people who came early in the morning to pray with me before the tabernacle. They were simple people, a seamstress, a bricklayer, a widow, some young people. Together, we prayed the rosary with a faith that would make the martyrs proud. At the time of communion, when I placed the host on each one's tongue, I saw tears in their eyes. They believe, they understand. Sometimes I wonder why I was chosen to see all that. I am not holier than anyone else. I make mistakes every day, but maybe that is exactly why I did it, to show that God's grace works even through the weakest. When I look back, I see that my life can be summed up in two parts, before and after that light. Everything I did before seems colorless. Everything I did after, even with all the setbacks, was worth it. Now that I am old and in poor health, I feel that my time is running out, but I'm not afraid. When the time comes, I hope to hold a rosary in one hand and a consecrated host in the other. I know that the battle for the church will go on without me, but I also know that we are not alone. The same Jesus who showed me the crisis also promised that the gates of hell would not prevail. And I believe him. This may be my last entry in this journal. If you are reading this, know that every word is true. I do not care whether you believe me or not. I have done my duty. The rest is up to you. The question that remains is simple. When the storm comes, and it will come, which side will you be on? Pray, be vigilant, love the truth above all else, and never, ever abandon the Eucharist. That is all I ask. Now, I must go and pray. The night is coming, but I know the light. Over the past few months, something strange has started happening during my masses. Sometimes, during the consecration, I feel a presence so strong that my hands visibly shake. The faithful notice. Some kneel more deeply, others exchange worried glances. Once, a child pointed to the altar and said out loud, "Mommy, there's an angel over there." Her mother scolded her, but I knew she had seen something real. These moments are like little signs, reminders that even when everything seems to be falling apart, the supernatural is still at work. But then there are the other moments, the ones that only I notice. Every now and then, when I'm alone in the sacristy, I feel a sudden chill, as if something is watching me from the shadows. Once, I saw my image in the mirror distort for a brief second, my face becoming something that wasn't human. I made the sign of the cross, and the vision vanished. These things scare me, of course, but they no longer surprise me. Jesus warned me that the battle would intensify, and I see it happening everywhere, even in my own heart, where the temptation to despair knocks at the door every day. Last night I had another experience that left me thinking. I was praying the breviary in the empty church when suddenly all the candles on the altar went out at once, as if someone had blown them out. The strange thing was that there was no draft. All the windows were closed. I stood still, waiting. Then slowly, one by one, the candles lit up again, of their own accord. It was not a natural phenomenon, I am sure of that. It was like a reminder. The light may seem to go out, but it will never be completely extinguished. This morning I found an anonymous note in the confessional. It simply said, "Father, keep going. There are more of us than you think." I don't know who left it, but it made me think of that part of the vision where Jesus showed us the remnant. They are out there, scattered, often hidden. Priests who still celebrate Mass with reverence, nuns who spend nights in adoration, lay people who keep the faith alive in their homes. We are not alone in this struggle, even when it may seem that way. The situation with the diocese got worse. I received an official letter advising me to tone down my homilies. They said my emphasis on topics such as sin and the final judgment was causing unnecessary discomfort. What hurt me most was seeing the signature at the end. It was from a priest I had known since seminary, a man who used to have a missionary fire. Now his tone was bureaucratic, almost mechanical. I prayed for him that night, wondering what shadows could have led him to this, but there are victories too. Last week, a young man came to me after Mass. He was shaking with tears in his eyes. "Father," he said, "I haven't been to confession in 10 years. Today, during your homily, it was as if Jesus himself was nudging me." His confession lasted almost an hour. When he came out, his face was radiant. These moments are like fuel for my weary soul. They show that no matter how many abandon the truth, there will always be hearts that yearn for it. Fun fact, since my near-death experience, I have developed a strange sensitivity. I can tell when someone who walks into church is in a state of grave sin. It's not something I see, it's more like a spiritual smell, a mixture of rusty metal and rotten fruit that only I seem to notice. At first it scared me, but now I understand. It's a gift for confessional ministry. These are the people who need God's mercy the most. Another phenomenon. Sometimes during Mass, I see brief flashes of people's spiritual condition. A man who seems to be shrouded in dark mist. I later discovered he was addicted to pornography. A lady with a golden light around her hands. She prayed the rosary every day. A young girl with something like black thorns around her neck. She carried hatred for her mother. These visions last less than a second, but they are vivid. I never talk about them directly, but they guide my prayers and counsel. Winter arrived, and with it, a strong flu that left me bedridden for 2 weeks. It was a strange time between physical pain and vivid dreams where I would return to that light. In one of these dreams, Jesus showed me something new, maps of the world with points of light that pulsed. Some places had many lights, Africa, parts of Asia. Others were almost dark, Europe, big cities. I understood that they were centers of true faith. The most surprising thing, many were in poor, simple places, far from the great centers of ecclesiastical power. When I recovered and began celebrating Mass again, I noticed something different about the congregation. Some who had come out of obligation were now more attentive. Others who had been late were now arriving early to pray. It seemed that my illness had made some realize that I would not be around forever, and that the message I bring is urgent. Even the most inattentive altar boy, a 12-year-old boy, now serves with a reverence that moves me. Small signs of hope in the midst of crisis. This morning, as I was preparing the chalice for Mass, I had a brief but powerful vision. For an instant, the wine in the chalice seemed to turn into living blood, pulsing as if it had a heart of its own. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough to make me fall to my knees. The seminarian who was helping me looked startled. "Is everything okay, Father?" All I could manage to say was, "He's really here." This certainty that I'm not fighting for ideas, but for someone real, is what keeps me going. In the afternoon, I received a visit from a young priest from another diocese. He had heard rumors about me and came to see for himself. He expected a fanatic, but found only a tired old man who loves the Eucharist. We talked for hours. When he left, he was different. "Father," he said as we said goodbye, "I think you saw what many of us are beginning to feel." He gave me a tight hug. Another soldier awakening for battle. The fire may be dying down in many places, but the embers are still hot. I've started to notice an interesting pattern. Whenever I'm about to give up, something small but significant happens. Last week, for example, I was wondering if it was worth it to keep fighting when I found a letter under my door. It was from a woman I had helped years ago when she was considering an abortion. It included a picture of her son, now 5, smiling. "He's named John in your honor," she wrote. Coincidence? I don't believe in them anymore. The other day, after a particularly difficult Mass, where only 4 people showed up, an elderly woman approached me. Without saying anything, she placed something in my hands, a still warm piece of homemade bread. "Jesus also gives himself to us in simple things, Father," she said with a toothless smile. I ate the bread, crying. These small gestures are like direct messages. "Keep going, I'm here." And so I go, one day at a time. A disturbing development. Some parishioners have begun reporting strange phenomena in their homes after committing to a more serious prayer life. Objects moving on their own, unexplained sounds, terrifying nightmares. One man showed me scratch marks on his back that had appeared overnight. At first, I was hesitant to talk about it. I didn't want to cause panic, but now I understand. When someone starts taking their faith seriously, the enemy shows his claws. I organized a special prayer group for these people. I taught them the power of holy salt, holy water, and the rosary. Most importantly, I told them not to be afraid. If they are attacking you, it is because you are on the right path, I explained. Some modern priests would scoff at such things, calling them medieval superstition. But I saw the other side. I know that war is real, and these courageous believers who face harassment for trying to live holy lives are the true heroes of this story. Today, I turned 78. My body is weak. My joint pains get worse every winter. My vision is no longer what it used to be. But spiritually, I feel stronger than ever. There is a certainty within me that no storm can shake. I know my days are numbered, and that doesn't scare me. In fact, it even excites me. Soon I will see that light again, but this time for good. My only regret, not having started fighting sooner. I spent so many years worrying about things that don't matter. Impressions, a church career, keeping up appearances. If I could go back in time, I would tell my younger self, don't waste your time. The kingdom needs warriors, not bureaucrats. But there's no point looking back. Now my focus is on preparing the younger ones for what's coming. They will be the ones who will weather the worst of the storm. This will be my last entry. My health has been rapidly deteriorating over the past few weeks. The doctors say my already fragile heart is failing. I know what that means, but I am at peace. Tonight, as I write these lines, I can feel a presence in the room. It is not threatening. It is as if they are here, waiting to take me home. I leave this